Welcome to It's Good to Be Smart. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Mulder. I love to learn new things, and I hope you do too, because it's good to be smart. Today, we are diving into something so small you can't even see it. Atoms. What are they? How did scientists figure out they exist? And how has our understanding of atoms changed over time? Let's start at the very beginning, over 2,000 years ago, with some ancient Greek philosophers. Around 400 BCE, a philosopher named Democritus had a radical idea. He suggested that if you kept breaking down a piece of matter into smaller and smaller pieces, you'd eventually get to something so tiny it couldn't be divided anymore. He called these smallest pieces atomos, from the Greek word meaning indivisible. And that's where we get our English word atoms from. So let's try a thought experiment to try and see how Democritus got to his idea of atoms. Picture a loaf of bread, and imagine cutting it in half. Then cut the half of a loaf in half. Then cut the half of a half loaf in half. Then cut the half of a half loaf in half. And keep on cutting, and cutting, and cutting, until you can't cut it anymore. Can you picture what that would be like? You'd be cutting smaller and smaller pieces until, eventually, it's impossible to cut it anymore. At that point, the bread would be uncuttable, unsplittable, or indivisible, right? And that's the idea of an atom, according to Democritus. Eventually, things are atomos, indivisible. Now, Democritus didn't do any experiments to back this up. His idea was more of a thought experiment, and it wasn't widely accepted at that time. In fact, another influential philosopher, Aristotle, disagreed, and he thought matter was made up of just 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. And because Aristotle was much more influential, his idea dominated for centuries. But Democritus's concept of atomos didn't disappear completely. It just waited for science to catch up. Let's fast forward to the 1800s. Enter John Dalton, an English scientist and teacher. Dalton conducted experiments with gases and came up with the first scientific atomic theory. He proposed that all matter is made up of tiny, indivisible particles that he called atoms. In Dalton's model, you can picture atoms as tiny marbles, solid spheres that interact in simple, straightforward ways. According to Dalton, atoms of the same element are identical, and atoms of different elements combine in specific ratios to form compounds. This was a big deal. Dalton's work gave scientists a way to think about matter that could be tested and measured. But it didn't explain what atoms were made of or how they behaved. That would come later, thanks to some groundbreaking experiments. Let's jump to the late 1800s. J.J. Thomson, a physicist, was working with something called a cathode ray tube. And during his experiments, he discovered tiny particles that were much smaller than atoms. And these particles had a negative charge. Thomson called them electrons. This was the first clue that atoms weren't indivisible after all. They were made of even smaller parts. Thomson proposed a new model of the atom that became known at that time as the plum pudding model, but might make more sense to you if we would call this the chocolate chip cookie model of atoms. Imagine a blob of positively charged material with tiny negatively charged electrons scattered through it, kind of like chocolate chips in a ball of cookie dough. While Thomson's idea of atoms was groundbreaking, it wasn't quite right, and the search for a better model continued. In 1911, Ernst Rutherford conducted his famous gold foil experiment. In this experiment, he shot tiny particles at a thin sheet of gold foil, expecting them to pass straight through. To his surprise, most particles zoomed right through as predicted, but some particles bounced back as if they'd hit something solid. And this led Rutherford to propose that atoms have a dense, positively charged center that he called the nucleus. In his explanation, he suggested that the particles that bounced back in his model had collided with the nucleus. In this model, the electrons are surrounding the nucleus, but there must be some space there that most of the particles he shot at the gold foil could pass through between the electrons. Maybe a way to picture Rutherford's atomic model is to think of it kind of like a peach, with a pit at the center representing the nucleus, and the space around the electrons being the flesh of the peach. Rutherford's model was closer to the truth, but it still left questions unanswered. How are these electrons arranged? And why didn't they just go crashing into the nucleus? Enter Niels Bohr. In 1913, Bohr did further experiments similar to Rutherford's, and as he analyzed the results, Bohr came to an understanding about the energy of electrons. Bohr suggested that electrons move in specific orbits around the nucleus, much like planets orbiting the Sun. These orbits, or energy levels, explained why atoms emit light at certain wavelengths. So Bohr's model might be best described as the solar system model of the atom, and this is still the way many people picture atoms, with a dense nucleus made up of protons and neutrons at the center, and electrons orbiting around the nucleus, with mostly empty space in between. Again, Bohr's model was a huge leap forward, but as you might have guessed by now, it wasn't the final word. In the middle of the 20th century, scientists developed the quantum mechanical model of the atom. Instead of imagining electrons moving in fixed orbits, this model describes electrons as existing in a cloud-like region around the nucleus. The electron cloud shows where electrons are most likely to be found at any given time. Maybe you can picture the fast-moving blades of a fan to help you imagine this. When you're looking at the blades of the fan spinning, the blur makes it look almost solid, even though you know there are gaps between the blades. The same sort of thing is happening with the electrons zooming around the nucleus in this electron cloud. They're moving so fast we can't tell exactly where they are. The model is based on the principles of quantum mechanics, which are pretty mind-bending but incredibly accurate when it comes to explaining atomic behavior. And that brings us to today. The modern atomic model includes a nucleus made of protons and neutrons surrounded by an electron cloud. Protons have a positive charge, electrons have a negative charge, and the neutrons are neutral. Together, these particles make up all the matter in the universe. Pretty amazing, right? Before we wrap up, here are a few more fun facts about atoms. Did you know that there are about 7 billion atoms in your body? That's a 7 followed by 27 zeros. Atoms can last forever. Atoms are so stable that most of the ones in your body have been around since the creation of the Earth. They just get rearranged through chemical reactions into different combinations. Atoms that were once part of carbon dioxide in the air might be absorbed into a lettuce leaf, and later when you eat and digest that lettuce, your body might use those same atoms to build up your muscle cells. That's wild, isn't it? And here's a mind blower. Atoms never truly touch one another. Even though it might feel like you're sitting on something solid or holding onto something solid, the electrons in your atoms repel the electrons in other atoms, meaning the atoms never physically touch one another. So what have we learned today? Atoms are the building blocks of matter, and our understanding of them has evolved from ancient Greek philosophy to cutting-edge quantum mechanics. Each discovery has brought us closer to understanding the fundamental structure of the universe. And scientists continue to study atoms today. So who knows if there will be more new discoveries that will help our understanding of atoms continue to develop. That's the nature of how science works. We keep on learning new things about the world, and knowledge deepens through the process of discovery. Thanks for joining me for this episode. Hey, nice work leveling up your brain power today. Remember, smart isn't something that you are, it's something we become as we're learning. So keep listening, keep learning, and keep getting smarter every day. It's Good to Be Smart is created and produced by me, Dr. Dave Mulder, with the support of the National Science Foundation through a Robert Noyce educational grant. Subscribe to this feed so you'll never miss an episode, and check out our home on the web, goodtobesmart.com. And until next time, keep asking questions, stay curious, and keep learning, because it's good to be smart.